Welcome to the Jack Hopkins Show podcast, where stories about the power of focus and resilience are revealed by the people who live those stories. And now, the host of the Jack Hopkins Show podcast, Jack Hopkins.
Hello and welcome to the Jack Hopkins Show podcast. I'm your host, Jack Hopkins. And today I have Eric Richardson with me, who you are going to learn a lot more about in just a moment. I had a phone call with Eric 2 or 3 days ago. He's a Democratic nominee in my state of Missouri. And you know, there are times in life where a politician can give you like a 2 or 3 word label of what they're going to do for you if elected. But they can't tell you how, or they can't explain it to you, the process of getting there. And 9 years of Trump now, if it's taught us anything, it's taught us that we need to know more about how people are going to do what they promise to do. And on this phone call, Eric Richardson took this topic and explained it in such a way that right in the middle of it, I had this epiphany. I'm like, my God, this guy is explaining this in a way that not only holds the attention of, but will be understood by anyone who's listening to it. This is a guy who can communicate. He can back up any idea he presents in terms of what he's going to do. And he can also explain why we should all be considering doing something that he's doing, and that is running for office as a Democrat, especially when a little voice in the back of our head says, what's the point? We're in a red state. So, Eric, welcome to the show.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Jack. I love the show, and I've been a big fan of yours online, following your work and appreciate your insights. So this is a really cool opportunity for me.
You know, I know you have an online e-teaching business. Can you tell a little bit more about that? Because I want people to be able to tie in why your brain works like it does.
Sure. So, I mean, I have kind of a broad background. I have worked in corporate life. I have an MBA and a graduate degree in philosophy, but then I also went back and got a 60 graduate credit hours of work for a teaching certification. And a lot of my career has been spent in teaching from kindergarten all the way through college, and then now beyond college. So, you know, in one form or another, whether I was teaching college courses or teaching first and second graders or middle school, a lot of those things still carry over into my business role, but they also carry over, and it's easy for people to hear when they're talking to me. It carries over into the kind of things that I really want to accomplish and what pushed me to go into politics.
When you were talking to me on the phone, I was very clear that you were not going through some pre-planned template of explaining it. This is something that's just become part of how you communicate. It's part of how you think. And
that's accurate. Yeah.
Part of how you think about the world and how you communicate with others. Can you tell us a little bit about why you decided, with everything that you have going on, because it sounds like you certainly are a busy guy, what prompted you to run for office in the first place?
Yeah, so you know, it's kind of an interesting shift in direction, because what happened was that I started getting more and more engaged and involved with rural economic development. So I've done some research and a little bit of freelance writing, and then I've started doing some training on what it really takes at a nuts and bolt level to help rebuild and rejuvenate rural economic communities, right, beyond just the agricultural sector. And as I looked at those things and started to see how those pieces fit together, I realized, like, you know, part of the challenge is that the help that we need, the help that small communities need, they can't do that all by themselves. And, you know, in Missouri, we've had a Republican supermajority for like 20 years.
Right.
And for those of you who don't know, a supermajority means that the legislators don't need any Democrats to sign on to a bill in order for them to be able to pass it. So they don't have to collaborate. They don't have to compromise at all. And so the things that they're not doing to help those communities, so communities can't solve these problems themselves. They need resources. And a lot of times there are resources out there, but nobody's helping the community learn about them, find them, access them, walk them through that process. And so our rural communities are imploding, right? There's all this low-hanging fruit that the legislators could be helping us reach, and they're just not. So we see things like, healthcare is disappearing in rural communities from Missouri. And the sad thing is it's not just Missouri, right? I mean, this is a common challenge for a lot of states and a lot of rural districts. So healthcare is disappearing. Our public education is getting squeezed. Our access to childcare, like something like 70% of Missouri is a childcare desert, which means if you're outside one of the major metro areas, right, it's almost impossible to find childcare. And that means that predominantly, like a lot of women are being trapped out of the workforce. And so, right, I looked at that and I went, look, the things that are missing are not complicated or hard to understand in the way that my mind works. I'm like, we just need somebody who's taking the effort to teach them about these and to put policies in place to make it easier for people to get access to this stuff so that these communities aren't having to solve these problems by themselves. They've got sort of a big brother or a mentor, a big sister holding their hand and helping them do this. And so, I fight very hard for philosophical reasons and political reasons to create true equality for women. So opportunities and roles and support systems. But I also take on that fight as a politician on a very practical level, because a lot of the things that are causing these rural communities to shrink and decline in terms of their prospects, those are centered around the same issues that have to do with women's opportunities. So that disappearing childcare, that disappearing healthcare, I mean, that means that women are trapped out of the workforce, and that hurts us in two ways, right? So one is the available talent pool that we have in a community is shrunk down, which means it's harder to attract businesses or to maintain businesses that launch here. But the other problem is that those exact same factors also prevent new families from wanting to move here. So, right, if there's not access to childcare, if our education system is on the decline, if there's not a close healthcare and maternity doctors in rural Missouri it's like playing the lottery to try to find one. They're not going to move here. They're not going to come to these communities. And that's the talent. Those are the people that are in a position to relocate, but they're not coming here. And so we're trapping these women out of the workforce. It's hurting us in both of those ways, but it also perpetuates some of those dynamics that we see the Republicans talk about, like, oh, the poverty levels. Oh, right. Well, I mean, part of the reason that we have poverty levels as high as we do, because for women, the incidence rate of being below the national poverty level is like 3 times higher. And these are the reasons, because they're trapped in this situation, because as much as we like to think that we've advanced, right, the child care burden, the senior care burden is a very similar challenge, right? That tends to fall on the women in the family. So that means they're not pursuing their careers. They don't have resources. They don't have options. Then it makes it a challenge for them to get housing, affordable housing. And so it kind of goes around in a circle. And so I'm very passionate about that. And, it's easy to be passionate in a way, and because of the training that I've done and the research that I've done, I see exactly how we can put those first few pieces. If we can connect a couple of nuts and bolts, right, that starts a domino effect, right? If we can create business and nonprofit and government coalitions to strengthen the child care seats available in a given community, that's a huge domino, right? As soon as you free up an additional 10 or 20% of your workforce, that spills over. Now you've got, businesses staying afloat or growing, or new businesses launching. You've got increased sales tax revenue for the community. You've got, sometimes the smartest people in the community are the women, and now they've got time and resources to be involved with city leadership or with community organizations or the Chamber of Commerce. And so it starts to multiply and spread outward.
In our phone call, and I want to address what you talked about there specifically.
Yeah.
What you couldn't have known during that phone call, because I had never told you, so I'm revealing this to you for the first time today. But as you were explaining that, you very clearly explained to me, without knowing it, why I probably made a mistake just a few years ago. And I was thankful for being able to understand that on a much clearer and cleaner level. And I want other people to be able to understand this as well. So the reveal is, during about the middle of COVID in my county, someone who knew I had a background in the Navy as a hospital corpsman and had done some nursing for a while after I got out of the Navy, and also knew I was very pro-vaccine, right? They knew I was very outspoken against Trump. They messaged me and said, look, there's a position coming open on the Department of Health on the board, right? We'd like for you to consider running. Now, one of the first things I factored in after they had sent me this message, in 2020, of the people who actually voted, and as you know, in these smaller rural counties, the actual number of people who vote is embarrassingly slim.
Yeah.
But of the people who did, almost 8 out of 10 people in my county voted for Donald Trump in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
The first thought that came to my mind was, nobody who's anti-Trump is going to win the election for this Department of Health spot. And of that, I was right. I wouldn't have. But I also realize why now, after your explanation, why it might have been a mistake for me not to run anyway. Can you elaborate on the explanation you gave me without knowing it?
Yeah. I mean, there are two parts to that. The one part is we still need people to run, because those members of our community still need to have an opportunity to feel heard. They need to see those things being addressed. And even if we can't necessarily flip the seat, right, which is what people tend to focus on, right? Everything that we can do, there are a lot of ways to win. Everything that we can do that can count as a win, whether that's teaching people how to engage, increasing voter registration, right, growing the involvement in the local Democrats club. Every time we do one of those things, it helps to give people who have a feeling that it's a hopeless fight, it gives them back a feeling of empowerment, like it's not hopeless, right? If we can show them that they can make a difference, they can move that needle, then one of these times it is a flippable district, right? I mean, so, part of the challenge of doing that is that we still want those people to have a voice, even if they don't have the seat. And the reason for that is that it's not hopeless. It's not impossible, right? It's hard. It feels challenging. And so part of the reason to run, and, in my case, I started my campaign running for the seat for U.S. Congress, which stretches across kind of the northern third to half of Missouri. But my goals are very much the same. And if I could run for this seat in my community for the state legislature and show people that what they can accomplish, right? Even if we don't flip, it would be a small miracle if we flip the seat. But even if we don't, if we move that needle, then that gives people all over Missouri and into the other states, it gives people in these rural districts that feel really red a sense of hope, a sense that there is a reason to do this and a reason to fight, because every time they engage and they push for these kinds of changes, they can create those small impacts, right? Like they could increase the childcare available in their community so they don't flip the seat. But people realize they're not alone because we've all started speaking out, right? We've got this phenomenon where you have blue dots in an ocean of red, and they think there are fewer than there are. And once you start speaking out, they realize, like, wait, 1 out of 4 of us, 1 out of 5 of us, 1 out of 3 of us actually feel the same way. That's enough people to accomplish something, even if it starts small. That's enough of us to help make a difference in who ends up on city council, or that's enough to make a difference in whether or not we get access to some rural healthcare options. And so giving people a realization that it's not impossible, that they're not alone, that's huge.
One thing I compare this to, Eric, I look back, I graduated in the mid-'80s from high school, right? I thought we had one gay student in the community when I was in high school, right?
Yeah.
Years later, 40 years later, I find out, no, we had several gay students in our school system here. It's just that because nobody was stepping forward, nobody else felt comfortable stepping forward. So they didn't get to have that feeling of, I'm not alone, right?
Well, that's a perfect example. And an issue that we fight with in rural communities. I mean, that's one of the things that I have tried to tackle. And, it's funny, I use an example that I think you'll appreciate. As I began reaching out to talk to some of the people in the community, I wanted to put together a panel discussion for our Democratic group, because not everybody has LGBTQ in their family, for instance. But so in a community like this, reaching out to try to make those connections, it's a little bit like being a Cold War spy. Like, well, I don't know. Are you a spy? Like, who's asking? Why do you want to know? Like, well, I don't know if I am. I might say that I am, but I don't know who's asking. And so there's this problem because you don't want to, as I call them, the hillbilly Stasi, right? Like, you don't want to alert the antagonists who are going to, become hostile. You don't want to accidentally out people that aren't out. But you have to take those tentative first steps. I mean, that's a beautiful example that I lived through myself, and that I try to figure out a way to solve exactly the same. I love that you brought that comparison in.
Well, and you bring up an important point about people not wanting to feel outed and being kind of thrust into that position where maybe in some cases, they find themselves in danger. And looking back, I know one of the reasons, if not the reason, the person who had contacted me and said, would you consider running for this? They knew that was not a factor for me. They knew I had no reservations. If it was something I felt like I should do, that wouldn't prohibit me. Now, granted, and it's taken me a while to realize this, not everybody thinks and feels in that same way. I'm kind of an outcast in that, or the black sheep, I should say, in terms of how much I'm able to, or willing rather, to put out there and then go, we'll whatever happens, happens. That's not most people. So I kind of feel like I missed an opportunity to do something there at a critical time. Again, I was focused, as you talk about so clearly. I was focused on, can I win this? Can I win the election? Can I get the seat on the board? Now, if you ask a question like that, and that's the only question you ask, then in a community like this, you're probably not going to run. But if you're asking different questions, like, can I not win the election, but still make a difference just by having run and campaigned? And the answer to that, as you've painted a clear picture of, is yes, you can. And that's what really impacted me in that phone call, is that you can talk to somebody who would potentially be a great candidate, who's thinking about running, but then kind of gets stopped in their tracks by that, I can't win.
Right.
And you can lay out a case, as you did for me, why that's not necessarily a reason to say, no, I'm not going to run.
Yeah, and the way the media likes to portray elections and campaigns sort of plays into that, right? Because they really love that horse race analogy. Sure. Like, he's running ahead, he's raising more money, he's not raising more money. I mean, one of the one of the challenges that I set early on to try to circumvent that is that I don't want us to raise as much money as the Republicans, because if you do, right, that's not a model that you can replicate everywhere, right? So I haven't shown people a new way to solve that problem, right? I haven't made it believable, because they could look at that and go, oh, well, yeah, but he raised, $300,000. I'm not going to do that. So if I only won because I did that, then I haven't actually accomplished what I was setting out to do, which is to show them that it's a lot more achievable than they think. Right. And so, I've raised very little money, and I hope to spend very little money. Now, there are pluses and minuses. That changes how likely I might be to flip the seat, but as much as I move the needle, people can look at that and go, that's what he did without having to get a huge pile of money underneath him. And that's more of a win. That, right. And look, I'm not a perfect candidate, and that's another challenge. People like, oh, well, the kind of people who run for office, they're whatever. They're beautiful, they're smart, they're accomplished, they don't have mistakes in their past, they've got amazing careers, and I am always glad to sit down and go, oh, no. Now, certainly we've been helped in that by characters like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who have sure that illusion that we often have. But people sort of imagine to themselves like, well, I'm not the kind of person who, well, no, in fact, you are. And here, it's like, just you getting involved, here's what happens to your community. Here's how people start rallying around, and people start feeling heard, and people start getting involved. I would love, and I'm always straightforward, like I would love to have 5 new candidates running across rural sections of Missouri next year. They're like, yeah, you convinced me that I should be one of the people who runs. And that doesn't have anything to do with whether we flip the seat. And it doesn't even have to do necessarily with whether they succeed in creating economic change in their community, right? That's an additional win. But every one of those people that feels like, wait, I am the kind of people who run or get engaged, yes, or who become community leaders. That's empowering.
To go back to the example that I used a moment ago, and to bridge over from what you are saying, when there's just one, we'll just go back to the mid-'80s. Mm-hmm. If there's just one suspected gay student in the entire school system, there's no question about it. There's not going to be any curiosity or inquiry into even wanting to know about the life of a gay person, or what are some important topics and concerns to them. When you have 5 who are no longer suspected because they've come out as openly gay, you reach a number where it gets much harder for people not to become curious, and not to just look at that one anomaly and say, see, the rest of us are normal. We've got this one gay student, but when you've got 5, 10, 12, now all of a sudden you're having to face a reality, right? That it's not the anomaly that you are, that it makes you comfortable to believe that it is. So I see that same thing, as you know well, in a small rural community, there's a lot of overlap between somebody running as a Democrat and a gay student.
Right. Let me give you another example, Jack. Yes. There's another really great example that has to do with overcoming the version that we're handed, right? So when we had integration of the armed services, right? So when there were black men serving right beside white guys in World War II, that did so much to overcome, because people, and I can give an example from myself as a kid growing up, right? Like, people were able to look at that and go, wait, I know, like, I served in the military. I had black guys in my unit. They're not like that, like I'm being told they are. They don't fit that caricature that we're being handed. And that helps to puncture that myth that got built. So with African Americans in the military, with gay people in rural community, whatever that example, well, and you know what, with women, it happens very much the same way. So there was a very interesting study that showed, people like, oh, well, women are better at certain things in management. Like they have certain strengths that are different than men's strengths in management. And so that's why it ends up not having as many. But in fact, that perception of what things they were strong at, it turns out that's determined by whether you've ever known women in leadership positions. The more you've been exposed to women in leadership and management positions, the less likely you are to think that their strengths are in a different area. And there's no amount of talking about it that can get you past that. You have to bump into it. You have to, you find out like, wow, Eric's a great guy. He's done a bunch of stuff for the community. Oh, and he's a Democrat. So maybe Democrats aren't quite what we thought.
That's a great point. That is a fantastic point, because the more you can make that, the fact that you are a Democrat, just a thin sliver of the pie.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Because so often you are dead on. So often what happens, and it's part of it is by design, the entire pie becomes he's a Democrat.
Right,
and so they can't see beyond that you are a Democrat, right? So the ability to be a participant in the community in a positive way, and for people, like you said, maybe to have no idea, at least until you decide to run, what your political affiliation is. Just know you're a good guy. Hey, you know what? This guy, when he talks about things, man, he really explains them well. It's just not some, we ought to do this. He says, this is why we should do it, and here's how we would do it. And again, that's what stood out in that phone call about you. I'm not going to mention any names, but I've had phone calls with some people fairly high up on the ladder running for office who could tell me all kinds of things we should do. But when I would ask them, how do we do that?
Right.
Or why specifically would we do that? They tried, but I really didn't learn anything I hadn't already known before they tried to explain it. And I'm thinking, look, this particular person may be able to get into office because they've got that charisma, as you spoke about. It might be a beautiful woman or a really handsome guy, or just have that appeal. But once they're in, I'm not comfortable that they can do anything different than the person that they're going to defeat.
Yeah, no, very much so.
You are really drilling down to, and I think as a country, because of this last 8 to 9 years, we know that, right? We know that, look, we've got to become a more educated voting base, right?
Right, yeah.
We can't just settle for, I'm going to make America great again, right? Because we saw how that worked out.
Too vague, right, yeah.
It sounded great. It was it's probably one of the best political hooks of all time.
Right.
But it was empty.
But he couldn't execute. Or look at the wall. Like, he can have this great idea, but like, it turned out he actually didn't know anything about how you actually get a wall built.
Right. I to date, I don't think that we've seen a check from Mexico.
Well, and there's another really good example too, Jack. I mean, one of the things that I know you'll resonate with, that I talk about is that, here in Missouri too. I mean, this is Ike Skelton country, right?
Yes.
I am one of the strongest advocates for our armed services and our veterans, the care we take of our veterans, right? For a non-veteran that you will probably see in politics. And I love that about Ike Skelton. And, there are a couple of concrete examples, so I talk about things like creating opportunities for women. And I talk a lot about our veterans being one of the people that have been pushed away from the table and need to be brought back. And in both of those cases, right, creating opportunities and educating them so they can access business startup funds, making that available to them, but then, right, not just throwing that money at it, but then pairing them with mentors who can help them get through that first 5-year danger zone for businesses, right? Like some 80 or 90% of businesses collapse by the end of their first 5 years in business. So give them mentors, because we've got people, brilliant people with talent and potential that could be launching businesses in these communities. And when you do that, so this is a very nuts and bolts piece, right? So then when you've got veterans who are bringing this experience that they've acquired, this leadership ability, this core integrity, or you've got women who are in these roles, that changes the dynamic of the community, right? Those automatically, right? Kids from both sides, but people from both sides are looking at that and going, well, of course women are strong leaders. Of course our veterans are an important voice in our community. And so once we do that, that's another one of those dominoes, right? So you've got small businesses that are launching, but more importantly, you've got talent that we already have, that you're creating an opportunity for them to unfold that talent in a way that impacts the community around them. Like, absolutely. I would love to see, right? So, you know, when people talk about like, oh, I'm going to pass this and I'm going to pass that, they get focused in on that legislative side, and they forget the constituent services side, right? I mean, look, we're still going to have a majority in the state legislature, even if I get elected. Hopefully they'll have to listen to us once in a while. So I don't go out there, I don't tell people like, oh, here are the 8 things I'm going to pass. My, you know, freshman legislator, I'm going to pass all these bills uphill. Like, no, right? I'm not going to promise that, and that's not the scorecard I want you to look at the end of that first 2-year term. What I'm going to promise and what we can point to is how many workshops did he have in the district to help people access resources for launching a business, for getting mentoring, for finding ways to create childcare opportunities, whatever those specific things are that we're trying to do to help that community. Look at that and go, did he help me understand that better? Did he connect me to resources? Did he follow up, right? Like, I can point people to resources all day long, but that doesn't mean they're easy to use or easy to implement. Did he follow back? You know, did he check back to see if I got an answer from the people I reached out to? I mean, there are all of these great opportunities, low-hanging fruit, right? So when I talk about, you know, I will get on a soapbox and talk about how we build up honor as this important value when we're selling our young men and women to go to war. And then when they come back and it's time for us to treat them with honor, we kind of forget about that, right? Like, if we lived up to this, if we want to tell them, this is a noble way to live your life, this is a thing worth doing, is living by this code of honor, and then we don't, well, that kind of puts the lie to that. That means we don't actually think it's a way, we're kind of spitting on that, right? That means we don't actually think that honor is a way that we should live our lives. So when you see politicians voting against veteran initiatives, you see them denying healthcare, the PACT Act, you know, those guys high-fiving after they vetoed the oh my God, that gets my blood pressure up. But so there's an example there, like, you know, I can talk about those values and those virtues and the kind of America that we want to be, but I can also turn around and say, which really resonated with you, and here's how we do that, right? I mean, one step, think about, because not only then does that veteran see that we lived up to our promise, so we built this set of skills, and now we're creating a way for him to leverage those, or for her to leverage those in the community. But think about, you know, their ability to access healthcare. Like, now they're able to get benefits, right? Maybe through their work, if not the veterans benefits. But then everybody that knows them, right? I mean, my father and my stepfather and my grandfather were all veterans. And I watched them struggle in different ways with that, right? With whether it was with healthcare or with career transitions or whatever. So it's not just the veterans that we're holding our promise to, but it's everyone in that family. And it's everyone who knows them, right? It's everyone at work who's like, oh yeah, you know, Jack is a great guy. Boy, he sure has a lot of health issues. Being a veteran doesn't look like all that great of a thing to have done. Well,
sure.
So and then we're like, I can't figure out why our recruitment is so low. Like, right. I can, because every one of those guys, every one of those women that we don't live up to our part of the deal, that's like dropping a grenade into the community perception of whether or not that's a way they want. Like, why would those kids grow up wanting to go into the military? Or why would those coworkers or the students in class? I mean, so anyway, but every one of those people that we can help set up a business, now the perception is like, oh, we've helped, like, this veteran. Yeah, I know Jack ran this great business in town when I was growing up. He was on the Chamber of Commerce. Like, that's the way it should work. And
You
so
know, you
that
talked about
that one nut and bolt that we put in place, that ripples outward.
right. You talk about the importance of mentorship in that whole
yeah.
process.
Oh my
And I
gosh.
posted just within the last couple of days, and I can't remember whether it was on Twitter or in my newsletter, but it was a study that I'd pulled up that, as you know, as a small business owner, most small businesses fail, right?
Right. Oh yeah.
But here's a very important statistic that ties right into your idea on mentorship. If you are over 55 years of age and start a new business, you become an entrepreneur at 55 or above, you have a 73% greater chance of your business making it. And the reasons cited were that you've already failed many times in life. You've gotten feedback from the world, and you've had to think things through. You've developed wisdom. Now, there are two ways, then, in my mind, upon reading that study, I immediately said, look, here are the two paths to a 73% greater success rate at your new business. Either wait until you're 55.
Be that wiser older mentor.
Or get mentored
or find one
by somebody that's 55 when you are 23.
That's brilliant.
And so, you know, otherwise, look, I had small business ventures when I was in my 20s, right? You make a lot of mistakes, and some of them prove to be deadly mistakes to the business, right? You just don't have that. I was trying to do it on my own, and I think a lot of young entrepreneurs get into this. I didn't want to be able to say I succeeded because somebody helped me, right? I wanted to show the world I can figure this out. I'll show you, right? Well, I did okay, but looking back, I needed help. I needed mentorship. And so when you go through a small rural town and you see all of the empty buildings, all of the businesses that used to be there, and we know a lot of that has come as a result of online business, but we also know that a lot of the new businesses that come in and try to fill that empty building don't make it. And we don't always know exactly why they didn't make it, but we can take a guess and probably get pretty close to they made some mistakes that they wouldn't have made if they would have had mentorship. And that applies to the veterans. Look, anybody that served in the military, even if they've just been in 4 years, they've learned some basic leadership skills.
Yeah, exactly.
While they are in the military, and they can be a mentor. You know, I think too many people, I'm talking about veterans specifically here.
Yeah.
I think too many veterans who have those basic leadership skills, they come out and maybe their MOS or the job that they had doesn't necessarily apply in civilian life. And so they've not been successful at a business. You know, maybe they wind up going to work at a factory and they think to themselves, I'm just a factory worker.
Right.
Who the hell am I going to mentor? Forgetting they have the very essential basic leadership skills that they can teach. And if you get those to somebody 12, 13, 14 years old, rather than waiting until they're 19, 20, as you did when you joined the military,
right?
Maybe that person goes to college or goes to a trade school where they otherwise would have just followed in the path of their family and worked at the local factory. You never know just how much you can deviate the path forward through mentorship.
Well, and you know, there's another great thing too that you sort of touched on, but maybe by accident, because it's not just about the leadership skills. It's also, a lot of it is about the teamwork skills. So, I mean, a part of it is that, you know, you described the challenges that you had and you had learned some of those things about being part of a team,
Right.
you got to amplify those a little bit more for people who weren't in service, right? So they didn't necessarily learn those. Now, some people learn some of those things because they were really engaged in sports or for other reasons. But part of what the veterans can bring to the table is knowing better than to think, at least often knowing better than to think that it's about doing it on your own. You don't do,
Absolutely.
you do nothing on your own.
No.
You barely get to go to the bathroom on your own.
Right.
That sense of teamwork, because even if you can't find a mentor, you can get a group of these guys together from your district, right? Maybe there are 4 or 5 guys starting small businesses in the community. You can at least get them together once a month to talk about what the challenges are up against, because just sharing those ideas and seeing it from different angles, that changes their odds of making a mistake that they don't see that the team does. And so, the veterans bring not just leadership skills, but that idea that being a part of the team is that, of course, that's how you succeed at stuff.
They do, because the military, at least when I was in, and it's been a while, but the military is pretty good at weeding out those that can't be a team player. In other words, the longer you are in, if you just can't coordinate with other people and work as a team, you're probably not going to last long. You're probably going to find something else in life to do. So somebody that's been in for any length of time, whether they originally liked working with others or not, they found a way to do so. And that's the thing. Look, not everybody has to love it, but if you've learned how to do it and can do it, you are light years ahead of somebody who doesn't know how and has never experienced it.
Yeah. I think, if we're not plugging our veterans into opportunities like that, that failure is on us. That's not a failure on them, right? If we're not helping them to see that their MOS doesn't define them, if we can translate what made them good at that and show them how that applies to other areas, right? That's a failure on us. And shame on
Eric, another thing I want to bring up with that is we have so many young men and women who have come back from war, who have psychological trauma, PTSD, major depression, and the stigma of mental health issues. One thing I think that gets in the way for a lot of veterans, in fact, I know it does, if they are somebody that has struggled at any point after their military service or during their military service, if they know that anybody in the community knows that, they immediately, by default, think, who would ever want me to help mentor them? But here's the thing. Not everybody who, in fact, a large portion of people who come out of the military and deal with psychological issues will not be dealing with them for the rest of their lives. With proper treatment, they'll come back to a baseline or close to it of pre-military. So just because you feel like right now, while you are struggling, you might not be the best mentor, that's not who you are at the core. And once you come back up to closer to who you are and you've still got that same skill set, there's no reason at all to think that people would look at you and think, oh, he can't be a mentor, right? But I think that's the mindset. And we've got to come up with ways to help people not only get through those psychological struggles, but then to also be able to shed the stigma, because you can get through the psychological issues, but then pack that stigma around with you as a healed individual for the rest of your life.
Well, and that's a perfect example that I talked about, that, the communities, and in this case, individuals, can't necessarily solve on their own, right? So you need somebody, above them, somebody with a better sense of the bigger picture, who's organizing that, who's connecting them with that. Because then, you're not necessarily going to Jack and asking him to be a mentor. There's an organization that partners you with a mentor. So they've already evaluated this person, right? So you wouldn't think like, well, is he a good mentor? Like, oh, the Veterans Mentor Initiative, whatever we call it, right?
Sure.
The Veterans Mentor Initiative, like they've already looked at this guy's background. They've assessed his skill set. Maybe they've put him through some workshops to help him learn. Like, so I'm putting my trust in them, not directly in him. And that's how we accomplish something that the individuals couldn't accomplish on their own, or that the community couldn't accomplish on their own. Same thing with women in business, right? I mean, especially, one of the things that's especially important is not just creating opportunities for women in business, but especially helping them launch and sustain businesses that are non-typical or non-predictable. So, right, like women opening a coffee shop. I mean, that's valuable, but that still confines them to a niche, right?
Yes.
Show me a woman who wants to open a construction project business, or a woman who wants to open an auto shop, or a woman who wants to open, right, a community lending organization. Something that breaks them out of the stereotypes, right? Like,
yes.
Great. Of course, it's often the case that women might be who run the flower shop, but that doesn't change our perception of women in leadership roles the way that all of these other areas that women are good and talented at. So getting them a resource, getting them a mentor helps them overcome those public perceptions like, oh, well, yeah, but women are this or women are that, or whatever the misconception is. Having that organized resource that helps to connect them and, pairs them with an older, woman in business mentor, that makes a huge difference in how other people perceive them. Like, oh, right, but she went through the Women's Business Initiative, so I know she's on track. Like, she's a good person for us to ask to help us do this community project. Like, we've added a sort of filter and a credibility stamp that changes the whole profile of success for them. And that's something that, a legislator can do, that the state can do, that the resources that we have access to, that doesn't have anything to do with changing the legislation, right? I don't have to pass a piece of legislation to help them connect with each other or to help them connect with resources. But by virtue of being in that position, I have a credibility. Like, it's a similar process writ on a bigger scale. Like, oh, he knows what these resources are, so we'll trust him. And then he plugs us in, and now we've got access to these resources.
Right.
It's just, a lot of this stuff, I had a great conversation a while back with one of the guys from the Shark Tank. And he said, one of the interesting things that he has found in coaching businesses is how often we know the stuff that we need to do. We just don't do it, right? We just need somebody to help us, like, okay, yeah, let's get over this hump. Same thing with helping these veterans get set up in business. They know a bunch of things they need to do. It's just hard to do. It's intimidating. It's daunting. There's a perception of the failure risks that get in our way. So that ability for a legislator to turn around and say, look, my measurement of success isn't going to be how many bills I pass. It's going to be how many new businesses launched in my district, right? That's a metric that means I helped people. I got some people to step up and maybe created some on the ground nuts and bolt impact, right? I could pass bills all day.
Sure.
Somewhere there still has to be the person between the bill and the ground level that actually makes it happen.
Right. And when I think of, because you mentioned the term resources so often in this episode, I think of it like this. Look, if I have strep throat, a bottle of antibiotics in my cabinet, that's a resource. But if I don't build the bridge between that resource and my involvement in utilizing that resource, nothing changes with my strep throat. And what winds up happening is I just build this continual supply of resources in my cabinet, but still have to deal with all of the issues those resources are designed for. And that's where I see that mentorship role come in, It's like, okay, so often, as you've pointed out, there have been resources available for counties or small communities that nobody even knew existed. Right?
Exactly.
So it's so many times people will say, well, if we just had the resources, when I think what they really mean, without knowing it, they're really saying if we just had someone to connect us with and get us started in utilizing these resources.
Oh, 110%, man. That's a perfect example. I love that.
Well, Tell me, Eric, how can people, first of all, how can people find you?
The easiest place to find me, I know not everybody's on Twitter, but that's where I tend to be the most active. So if you go on Twitter, I'm Richardson and then the number 4, Mo. So if you go in there, I mean, that's a great place to connect with me. My bio line, of course I have to say this, my bio line includes a link to donate to help me, right? And you're not betting on who's going to win the horse race. You're investing money. Like, this guy's going to take this money and he's going to use it to educate people. He's going to use it to help get people involved. He's going to reach out to volunteers and get them to step up and be heard. So yeah, connecting with me on Twitter is the easiest, best place to do it. I've got a website, but right now it's broken. I have to update. I'm not a tech guy, so I have to have my tech guy update my security certificate or something like that.
You got it.
But the most valuable thing there is, that it'll point you to some place like social media where I'm active, share my opinions. I'll comment on current issues. So I would love to have, people jump in and share their thoughts with me.
Good. Well, I think we can make that happen. One thing that has stood out about you during this episode that I can't really say has ever been the case with any other candidate that I've been talking to. For the entire time, you have talked not about things that you will do or that you can do in your community where you are running. You've talked about a nationwide concept, a nationwide agenda that anybody, anywhere can implement. And it's clear to me that you have a vision for making the country a better place, not just putting the spotlight on yourself and saying, I'm running for this election in this community, please help me. That never happens. People localize all of their suggestions or what they're going to do or how you can help. And so to have somebody come on and be willing to share and talk about how other communities, how other states from coast to coast can implement this mindset, this belief system, and these very tangible and workable solutions, I think speaks a lot about who you are as a person, which, as we've learned, who someone is as a person matters a lot when they are running for office. I appreciate that you see that, Jack. I mean, that's maybe the highest compliment that I could get. I mean, there's very much that sense. And, if you follow me on Twitter, I know you do, and other people, I actually had a really nice quote from Jamie Harrison, who's the chair of the National Democratic Party. And he said, something about how much work Eric is always willing to do to lift up the whole team. And same thing, like, that's about the highest compliment. I mean, right. Sure. I was a teacher. A part of me will always be a teacher. You can hear that in me talking about, making the people in my district better and smarter. But, I didn't go into teaching so I could get in the spotlight. I'm not a spotlight person, right? And I certainly didn't do it to make myself feel smart. I did it because I want to see other people succeed. And so I'm constantly looking, you'll see I probably spend, 20% of my time online trying to lift up other candidates around the state and around the country that I see, highlighting stuff that I love. I mean, it's hard to follow me for longer than a day and not know that I hold Mark Hamill up as this great example. Like, for a very similar reason, the guy, is one of the most iconic figures, and he spends all this time, like, connecting with people and lifting them up, like, celebrating their birthdays. I'm a dog person, so it gets to me when he goes on and, like, puts a broken heart for people who have lost their pets. I mean, sure, it's amazing what kind of impact that could be, but it also, helps to highlight what I'm saying. Like, that's the best kind of person I could picture being. So it means a lot that you saw that come through. Well, I think, let me, before I forget, how can people, because you've talked this entire time, you've talked about helping other people, which obviously, when we are looking at avoiding catastrophe in the end of democracy, that's something we do want to talk about, is how we can help each other as a nation. But you've talked about that almost exclusively. How can we, help Eric Richardson? What can we do? What can listeners, viewers do to help you?
You know, honestly, one of the things that I need at this point is support, is donations, right? So because of the way the campaign laws work, all of the work that I did to raise money for my congressional campaign, none of that can roll over to my state legislature campaign. And, you know, and I should maybe highlight just briefly how that happened, right? So I ran for most of last year running for that seat in Congress. And the day before the deadline to file with the Missouri Secretary of State, had amazing conversation with two different people in leadership for the state Democratic Party. And they said, you know what? Like, we really need your help to try to break this supermajority. So the thing is, in Missouri, we're only 3 seats away from being able to break the supermajority, which means at least part of the time they've got to get us to agree. And
Sure.
The reason that's important is that means they have to make their bills a little bit less extreme, or we won't agree to them. So anything that helps to pull the extremism back toward a balanced middle, I haven't even started on that. That's a huge issue for me. I want there to be 2 strong, healthy parties, and we are far from that right now on a national level and on a local level. But the help that I can get from people, if it's $1, if it's $2, if it's $5, that allows me to make up for that gap, right? So because I couldn't roll over that fundraising, and that means, right, being able to put signs out. You know, signs don't necessarily sway people directly, but it helps to fix that feeling that you're the only one, that you're alone. So every time people bump into a sign, I mean, it's a lot like bumping into pride flags. When you're driving through a community, if you see pride flags, it may or may not make you go to that business, but it also automatically makes you think, I'm not the only one in this community.
Right.
And that this community, you know, listens to some of those people part of the time. So,
Yes.
you know, it allows me to get signs. It allows me to get thank you cards into the mail to people who do support me. It allows me to get, you know, out here in the rural districts, it's almost impossible to knock enough doors.
Yes.
Right. So that means you got to have money to do mailings, and you got to have newspaper ads, and you got to have radio spots. So every dollar helps me do that, right? I mean, and the thing is, in a campaign like this, the benefit to a down ballot campaign is that, you know, like $1,000, that makes a huge impact, right? $1,000, you know, Ruben Gallego running in Arizona, that's not going to tilt the scale in his campaign. But here, that's huge, right? Like that's like 3 more ads or another radio spot during drive time or whatever that is. So you're looking at like a 10% increase in my advertising budget. Because as great as my ideas might be, a lot of times it's people just having seen and heard my name. It's just knowing there's an option, so that then when they get, you know, partly so they'll go to the ballot box, right? Like, well, why go? There's only ever one person to vote for. Because in districts like mine, a lot of times there aren't Democrats to even vote for. So a lot of the Democratic voters don't even show up. Like, well, what's the point? Like, I'm not going to vote for, you know, for the old boy network guy on the Republican side. They've been killing our country, our county for 20 years. So why show up? But, oh, there's an option. Okay, well, I'll show up. Well, so they've got to know there's that option. That means they've got to bump into my signs or my ads or hear me on the radio.
Yes.
Or, you know, they become listeners of the Jack Hopkins podcast, and then like,
sure.
We're all set then.
I want to point out to people, because I think we so often get locked into this. I know I used to get locked into this mindset of, well, I'm going to donate for him because he lives in my state, or I'll donate for her because she's running in my community. Look, one thing I have known the importance of since I left the Republican Party is the importance of donating to Democratic candidates everywhere to the extent that's possible.
Yes.
I have donated to countless Democratic candidates in other states, right? Because the mindset has to be, look, this is a national problem. Yes, we have people run on local levels on up, but now the idea is the way we approach solving the national problem is starting on that local level. So it's bidirectional. The more we can do to address the national challenge, the more will help the local level, and vice versa.
Well, 100%. David Pepper has done really cool work. I don't know if you've read his book. David
Yes.
Pepper is phenomenal. He's done a lot of work showing that it's the state houses where a lot of these battles are won and lost. And Missouri is a great example because you look at that and you go, well, this guy, this candidate I've never heard of in a district I've never heard of, but that supermajority is part of the reason that the Missouri is able to create these toxic politicians and then launch them into the national bloodstream, right? So people like Josh Hawley and Eric Schmidt and Sam Graves, I mean, these guys who were able to build momentum because they were in an environment where they weren't being challenged and where they were able to drive these extreme policies to become noticed on the national stage and get those resources. I mean, those guys didn't get sent to Washington, D.C. because of Missouri money. They'd get, like, once they come to the spotlight, they get money poured in from around the country to raise them up to that next level. So helping me win my seat, that sets an example that all the other candidates in these districts that feel impossible, that inspires them. But also, if I flip this seat, it means we slow the production of these toxic comic book characters like Josh Hawley, who then, get larger and become villains that impact all of us. I mean, not only was Hawley the first member of the Senate to challenge the results of the election, the 2020 election, his wife drove the lawsuits that helped to cause the downfall of Roe v. Wade.
Absolutely.
So like that one toxic politician like that, like everything we can do to stop that. And that means, sort of putting obstacles in place at the beginning of the river, because once it gets to the mouth of the Mississippi, it's massive. But if you go up to Minneapolis and you make changes at the headwaters, you can have a huge impact downstream. And that's sort of what's happening to us. So I love that you brought that up. Each seat.
Well, one other thing I want to bring up, because I think especially, here's what I find. I find that, as I'm sure you have, on more local elections, rural community elections, there are a lot of preconceived ideas about politics and how things work that aren't true, that don't apply, that sometimes keep people from getting involved in a way they otherwise would. What I'm talking about here specifically is, and I want to just lay this out on the table, unless you are Donald Trump, who has tens of millions of dollars coming in and a staff of attorneys 3 blocks deep to allow you to be able to do something like this, the run-of-the-mill candidate running for election is not able to funnel any of their campaign donations to themselves for personal use. There are many barriers and checks and balances put in place to keep that from happening. The kinds of checks and balances that, again, Donald Trump has the resources and the money to be able to keep at arm's length. Yeah. Right. So I think that's always important, because as I was growing up as a kid, and I still hear it today in some nooks, money. They just want more money, as though it's going to them personally. And that's not how it works.
Right. No, exactly. Well, and, for my case, for some of the other talented people that are running this cycle that ran last cycle, I mean, a lot of the Democrats still have to have their day jobs. I mean, campaigning is very time intensive. So you've got campaigning and you've got, keeping your yard mowed so the city doesn't come visit. And then you've got, taking care of your family, and you've got, leaving time to sleep or eat or exercise. And then you're comparing that against these people who, have resources and money to just campaign full time. I mean, it's ill, and it's a challenge. It contributes to the burnout, and it contributes to people thinking that you can only run if you're independently wealthy. And so if you guys help me show that doesn't have to be the case, then that means all those other people out there who are more talented than I am, they'll step up and run for offices, right? Like, I would love to have, smarter people than me stepping up, and there are plenty of them, but we've got to show them that stepping up for office allows them to make an impact. and that they're not in
Absolutely.
it by themselves. And so
Agreed.
those donations show them that, like, oh, if I step up, the community will get behind me, not just my district, but people from all over will help me pull that off. That's how we get, amazing people who are able to go in and make the landmark changes.
Well, Eric, on behalf of the listeners and viewers of the Jack Hopkins Show podcast, which experience has shown me there's some pretty cool people, right? There's some avid followers that truly have an interest in preserving democracy and learning about how they can do that on many different levels. So I hope we can get you a nice boost in donations. And I want to, one more time, have you tell people where they can find you on Twitter, how to get in touch with you.
Yeah, so on Twitter, I am Richardson, and then the number 4, and then Mo. M-O is capital. So Richardson 4 Mo. And if you're familiar with Act Blue, you can just look me up on Act Blue. So it's Eric Richardson, and you'll see my name there. So it's ERIK, and it'll say like Richardson from Missouri, I think is what it says on the account for when you plug it in to search for me. But like I said, if you're on Twitter, there's a link right there so you can go to the Act Blue page. But, you can also reach out to me. I've got email set up, eric@richardson4mo.com. So again, with the number in it. So eric@richardson4mo.com. You can shoot me an email if you want to find out ways to connect, or if you need help. Maybe you're thinking about running. Maybe you're a candidate. Maybe you're looking at how to help the people in your state or your district. I mean, reach out to me, and I'm glad to be a resource for whatever that means. If you're reaching out to help me, that's great. If you're reaching out because you need some help, I'm happy to do that too.
Perfect. I will be sure and put that contact information in the show notes as well, so people can find that easily, copy and paste, or whatever works for them. Again, on behalf of my listeners, my viewers, I want to thank you for what I feel like is the wealth of knowledge you have shared about workable concepts, strategies, beliefs about how we can shift our perspective and look at things like, should I run for office or not? Or does it matter that I might not win? You've really put a lot out there for people to think about, and I thank you. And maybe we'll get together and chat again sometime.
No, that's perfect, Jack. I love your work, and I love the show. So it was an honor for me to get to be on and to hear your perspective on some of this stuff too. Anything I can do to help you be more successful, let me know.
You've got it. Eric, thank you, and I'll be in touch.
Perfect. Thanks, Jack.